image of Lincoln today is bigger than life. And maybe that's how it should be for a president who had such an impact on us as a nation. America didn't become America until after Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln himself said at one point to a group of soldiers that he was living proof that any father's child could live in the White House.
The idea that a person could rise from that tiny cabin in Kentucky to the presidency of the United States is not just the American dream, it's the universal dream.
He was our greatest president and is deserving of all the honors that we can afford him. And especially here in Kentucky, we have allowed Lincoln to be lost as part of our history.
The Kentucky years had an impact on Lincoln throughout his whole life.
He dated Kentucky women. He married a Kentucky woman. His 3 law partners were all Kentuckians in some way. His closest friend, Joshua Speed, was from Kentucky.
As Kentuckians, we've started to look at Lincoln as a favorite son. He was not a favorite son, as opposed to Jefferson Davis, who was often held up as the favorite son. So reclaiming Lincoln as a Kentuckian, I think, is new.
Everyone and every place would like to claim a piece of Abraham Lincoln. Over the past century and a half, he's become such an American icon. We see him everywhere. And it seems every use of his name or his image further obscures the life of a very real human being. It makes you wonder if it's even possible to separate the myth from the reality. Well, we're going to try, and we're going to begin where he began. West of here, the state of Illinois proclaims itself the land of Lincoln. But only this place, near Hodgenville, Kentucky, has the honor of being the birthplace of the 16th President, Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln, I Too Am a Kentuckian is made possible in part by a grant from the Kentucky Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, leading Kentucky's commemoration of the 200th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, celebrating his Kentucky story and his legacy of freedom, democracy, and equal opportunity for all. And by the Kentucky Historical Society, providing connections to the past, perspective on the present, and inspiration for the future, administrator of the Kentucky Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission.
Here in LaRue County, Kentucky, at what was once called Sinking Spring Farm, is the Abraham Lincoln Birthplace National Historic Site. Inside what looks like a Greek temple, we discover one of the realities and one of the myths of Lincoln. Yes, he was born in a log cabin, just not this log cabin. Back in the early 1900s, when the memorial was built, this was believed to be the cabin where President Lincoln was born. But further research disproved that idea, and so the National Park Service now calls this the symbolic birthplace cabin. While the cabin is only symbolic, there's plenty of evidence that Sinking Spring is the actual location where Abraham Lincoln was born.
Searching for the real Abraham Lincoln, I think, is difficult. If you look around at the Sinking Spring Farm today, it is now a memorial. When the Lincolns were here, it was a 300-acre farm. And I think that people that come here to his birthplace looking for Abraham Lincoln, they don't find a place where a little boy was born in a log cabin. They find the cabin enshrined in the memorial building, but it's in such a formal setting. We see his shadow, but we often don't see who this person really was and what was in his head.
Abraham Lincoln has always been a personal hero of mine. My hometown of Greensburg, Kentucky is close by, and as a kid I came here a lot. I've always believed this was a special place, a place where one of the greatest men of all time was born. Now imagine my surprise when I found out a whole lot of people around the country don't know Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky. We know that both of his parents, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks, came through the Cumberland Gap from Virginia as young children in the mass westward migration following the American Revolution.
When Lincoln's parents came to Kentucky, and then even at the time when Lincoln was born, Kentucky was still very much a frontier state. It was the place for people on the make to go. It was the land of opportunity, the land of plenty, the Eden of promise.
We don't know specifically why the Lincolns came to Kentucky, that Abraham Sr., the president's grandfather for which he was named, came through the Cumberland Gap with Daniel Boone.
And he did not come as a poor man. He came and acquired a large amount of land in Kentucky in several locations. A large parcel of that land was located here in Jefferson County.
It was in Jefferson County at a place known as Long Run that the early Kentucky pioneer also named Abraham Lincoln and his three sons, Mordecai, Josiah, and Thomas, worked to clear land for a cabin. And here on a spring day in 1786, Abraham and his sons came across a band of Indians. A shot was fired, and Abraham Lincoln was killed. Not long after his death, Abraham's widow Beersheba and their 5 children left Long Run and moved to what is now Washington County, Kentucky. A recreation of their cabin now stands here at Lincoln Homestead State Park. As was the custom of the time, Mordecai, as the eldest son, inherited his father's entire estate. Mordecai went on to become a leading citizen of Washington County, and the home he later built for himself is still standing on a small piece of what was once a 5,000-acre estate. But for Thomas Lincoln, the youngest son, things were very different.
Thomas witnessed at the age of about 10 his father killed right in front of his eyes. His older brother Mordecai inherited everything, so young Thomas was a self-made man.
Thomas Lincoln was known as honest and hard-working, a skilled carpenter and cabinet maker. Several pieces of furniture attributed to Thomas are still in existence, as well as some of his other carpentry work, including the Lincoln Heritage House, which today sits at Freeman Lake Park in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Thomas Lincoln also built a cabin for himself in Elizabethtown, and in 1803, when he was just 25 years old, he bought a farm for which he paid more than $500 in cash. Around that same time, Thomas Lincoln met a young lady named Nancy Hanks.
Nancy was a young girl whose father died when she was just a baby. Her mother brought her through the Cumberland Gap and settled here in near Springfield in Washington County. And her mother remarried. Nancy went to live with her uncle and aunt, the Berries.
Thomas had noticed Nancy in Elizabethtown, it said at some camp meetings, and that she seemed to be a rather sad and lonely young woman. He took an interest in her.
This was the house where Thomas Lincoln courted Nancy, and right inside by the fireplace is where he proposed to her. On June 12, 1806, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks were married in Washington County, Kentucky. But as is often the case when you try to unravel the Lincoln story, things aren't always straightforward. Later generations of Kentuckians wanted to preserve it, so the actual cabin in which Nancy and Thomas were married was later moved to Harrodsburg. It now sits at Old Fort Harrod State Park inside a church-like structure known as the Lincoln Marriage Temple.
And they married in Washington County. They married in Springfield. So that the interesting thing is that this marriage record, most people thought it should be in Hardin County, and that's where they looked for it for years, and they didn't find it.
And one of the reasons for that is his parents were living in Nelson County when they married, and later when Washington County was formed from Nelson County, those records were moved over into our little courthouse here, and years later researchers came upon these documents, and so finally now we have the documentary proof that his parents were married, in fact married right here in Washington County. We're very proud of that, and I'm sure Lincoln would have liked to have seen those documents a long time ago.
Thomas and Nancy Lincoln settled in Elizabethtown, where soon their first child was born, a daughter they named Sarah.
Even though Thomas Lincoln lived in Elizabethtown, was a carpenter, a jack of all trades, he really wanted to farm. And so he and Nancy were able to acquire a rather substantial farm near Hodgenville, and he had that farm when Abraham Lincoln was born. So this would have been, of course, February 1809. On that farm, he built a small cabin, and it is said Thomas Lincoln came out of the cabin, stopped someone on the road, and said that they would have need pretty soon for a granny woman, and that they had better bring her soon to minister to Nancy because she was about to deliver.
We know Abraham Lincoln was born here because we have a lot of primary sources. First of all, we have the Bible, and that is an exhibit here in the park, and people that come can see the Bible. We also have a lot of court documents. We have the title and deed records in 1808 when they bought the property. We also have a first-person account of Abraham Lincoln's birth, and that is from his cousin, Dennis Hanks, who says that right after Nancy had given birth to Abraham, Thomas came over to the cabin and announced that Nancy had a baby boy.
The mythology of Lincoln is that he comes from this hardscrabble frontier family living in this log cabin, very poor. But in reality, the Lincolns were middle class in a frontier setting, and even perhaps above that. Thomas Lincoln, I think, was in the top 20% of the taxpayers in his county. So they were almost upper middle class. Now, having said that, you have to remember this is the frontier, and everybody is living in a log cabin, and there is no upper class. And so he did come from narrow backgrounds, but at the same time, he didn't come from total poverty either. Now, when he left Kentucky, they faced harder times, but in Kentucky, his father was well respected and well known, and Lincoln grew up in a well-respected household.
Despite their hard work and success, the young family was forced to leave the Sinking Spring farm in 1811. The problem was one that was common in Kentucky in those days.
The Lincolns were forced to leave the Sinking Spring farm when the title for the land came under dispute. And they left here and moved to Knob Creek, which is about 8 miles away, where they rented 30 acres of bottom land.
Lincoln has no memory of Sinking Spring Farm, and Knob Creek Farm is still there, and it's still very much the stage that it was, and been very lovingly taken care of by subsequent owners. And it is a place that Lincoln remembers and talks about, and I think is still evocative of the country Lincoln, the landscape Lincoln grew up in.
Sandy, here we are at the boyhood home, and I can just imagine a young Abraham Lincoln working these fields or playing out here right where we're walking.
Right where we're walking. There's been no development here since the Lincoln period, so we're very fortunate to have them intact.
What was life like for him here at the boyhood home?
Well, I think you could sum up a lot of it in one word, that it was hard. This was the main field, and they grew corn and pumpkins. Abraham would have been responsible for helping his father with planting crops. In fact, that's his first memory of planting pumpkin seeds in between the rows of corn as the corn is being planted. And he would have been responsible for a lot of day-to-day tasks, carrying water. He would have had to help his mother in the herb garden. He would have had to have helped with any farm animals that they had here. And he would have done a lot of other things.
There's a cabin that's been moved here on what could be the site of the original Lincoln home at Knob Creek. Because of its age and condition, we can't go in. But it's the one structure here that Abraham Lincoln himself would almost certainly have been in as a boy.
And this is actually Austin Gallagher's cabin. Austin Gallagher was a childhood friend of Lincoln, and he lived just down the road and on the other side, very close to Lincoln. He played with Lincoln as a boy. They moved the cabin, which would have been very similar to the Lincoln cabin, and put it on what they believed to be the spot where the Lincolns lived.
Typical frontier cabin would be about this size with dirt floors, I guess.
Dirt floor and a sleeping loft and a pole bed. So all of the cabins would have been built very similarly, and neighbors would have helped each other.
They weren't pioneers, but they lived on the frontier. Explain that.
I think that's an important distinction. Abraham Lincoln's grandfather was most definitely a pioneer. He left everything behind, loaded up a wagon with what goods he could bring through the Cumberland Gap, came through with Daniel Boone and Thomas Walker. They were true pioneers. But by the time Thomas, Abraham Lincoln's father, and his mother, Nancy, lived here, they were living on the frontier. There were other families living in the vicinity, about 9 families in this valley. There was no town of Hodgenville. There was just the mill there at the time. So they were living on the frontier.
No story of Abraham Lincoln is complete without a look at his education. Or maybe I should say his lack of education. He had less than 2 years of formal schooling, about half of that while living at Knob Creek.
For a short time, there was a school called the Blabb School, and it was about 2 miles up the road. The Lincoln's children wouldn't have gone on the road. They would have shortcut through the hills, would have taken them in a direct line of the school. Lincoln and his sister attended the Blabb schools, called Blabb schools because they recited their lessons. Out here, during that time, any kind of object like slates or pencils, papers, anything like that would have been very hard to come by. So they recited their lessons out loud, hence the name Blabb School. There were so many young boys like Lincoln born on the frontier, and they lived and died and they're forgotten. And what set him apart was probably his ambition, his talents, his intellect.
As a boy in Kentucky, he told one of his campaign biographers, when he was learning his letters, that he loved to make the letters. He got fascinated, and so if he could find a stick to make them in the dirt or make it in the snow or in the dust on a window or something like that, he would do that. He remembered liking to make the letters. He learned quickly how to read, something his parents could probably just barely do. And I just don't think there's any doubt that what we're seeing here is a born writer.
In addition to his interest in words, young Abe Lincoln loved to tell a good story, a trait he probably inherited.
Lincoln was a great storyteller, but his father was probably a better storyteller. And of course, that wasn't unusual on the frontier. But the fact is, not everybody becomes as adept at it as Lincoln. And Lincoln saw stories as not just a way of entertainment. He also saw them as a way of making a point, a way of bringing people onto his side. And so it became for him a tool.
And I think it began way back, really back in Kentucky, when, as it was said, his home there was on the Cumberland Trail, and his father was a great storyteller. And he used to listen to his father as a 7-year-old telling stories, and said he couldn't go to bed at night until he could recapture those stories in words that his little friends in the field would be able to understand. And then he would go out and stand on a tree stump and entertain his friends. Maybe that first indication of the pleasure of having a crowd of people who like you.
A love of words and a gift as a storyteller were only two of the skills young Abe Lincoln would learn on the Kentucky frontier. The roots he set down here would run deep, and those roots would continue to nurture Abraham Lincoln throughout his life.
The Lincolns were living at Knob Creek from 1811 to 1816. There was a claim made to about 10,000 acres in the Knob Creek Valley, which would have threatened all 9 of the families that were living there. That turned out not to have been valid, and none of the families there were evicted from the property. It was probably the last straw for the Lincolns after losing the court case and losing the Sinking Spring farm.
There was a great migration from Kentucky in the early 19th century. Ironically, Kentucky filled up very quickly, and there was very little land to be acquired. So there were other lands, new lands, pulling people.
In 1816, the Lincoln family traded a relatively comfortable life in Kentucky for the hardships of the then untamed wilderness of Indiana across the Ohio River. At that time, the 16-mile journey from the Ohio to their new homestead along the Little Pigeon Creek was long and arduous. Once on the Indiana shore, they had to literally carve a path through the forest so their wagons could pass. But soon enough, other Kentuckians joined the Lincolns in settling this part of Indiana. Among them were Thomas and Elizabeth Hanks Sparrow and young Dennis Hanks, relatives of Nancy Hanks Lincoln. We don't really know much at all about Abraham Lincoln's mother, not even what she looked like, as no portraits were made of her during her life. People who knew her recalled her as being either tall or average, thin or stout, plain-looking or beautiful. But everyone agreed that she was intelligent. Some called her brilliant, and we know she could recite long poems and Bible passages from memory.
I think Lincoln got a lot of his physical appearances from his mother. This kind of swarthy complexion, dark eyes, dark, coarse hair, that seems to come from Nancy Hanks. She must have been also a courageous and adaptable woman in the fact that here she is in a farm in Kentucky, doing fairly well, and all of a sudden she's uprooted and taken to the real wilderness of Indiana, where you really have to cut a farm out of the virgin forest. And she does that.
In the fall of 1818, along Little Pigeon Creek, there was an outbreak of an ailment known as milk fever, caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten a poisonous wild plant called white snakeroot. Those who fell ill included the Sparrows and their niece, Nancy. On October 5th, 1818, Nancy Hanks Lincoln died at the age of 34, having lived all but the first and last 2 years of her life in Kentucky. Today, the Lincoln family's Indiana home is a national memorial. The site, including his mother's grave, is open to the public. The death of Nancy Lincoln less than 2 years after the family's arrival from Kentucky was devastating. Her daughter Sarah was 11 years old, her young son Abe just 9. Yet his memories of his angel mother, as he called her, lasted throughout Abraham Lincoln's lifetime. Years after her death, he said of her, "All that I am or hope ever to be, I owe to her."
And I think what made it even harder for him was that when his mother lay dying, she simply said to him, "Abraham, I'm going away from you now, and I shall not return," not promising him that they would meet in an afterworld, which would have been a common conversation at that time, because death stalked these people in such unimaginable ways. And he said then that he became obsessed by the thought that dust becomes dust, that our earthly existence comes to an end.
For Thomas Lincoln, the death of his wife created a real dilemma. How could he take on the task of raising 2 children by himself while earning a living and building a homestead in the wilderness? But finding a new wife on the Indiana frontier would be near impossible. So, leaving his children at home with their cousin Dennis, Thomas returned to Elizabethtown, Kentucky.
Thomas Lincoln, within a fairly short time, as was common on the frontier, sought out another wife to help raise the children. And he comes back to Kentucky to a woman that he had known before. Some people argue that she had turned him down previously. We don't know that for sure.
Her name was Sarah Bush Johnston, though most people called her Sally. She was a widow living with 3 children in a small cabin and struggling to make ends meet.
He came back to Kentucky looking for her because I suspect he remembered her and must have been going after her, so that she must have made a big impression on him. He seemed to come with the determination that he was going to find his new bride-to-be, new wife in Elizabethtown, and he knew who it was going to be.
Sarah Bush Johnston, who was 31 years old and had lived her whole life in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, must have wondered what she'd gotten herself into when her new husband Thomas delivered her to the Lincoln homestead. The place was in horrible disarray. Her first order of business was to scrub the children and put some clean clothes on them. Then she set about bringing back some order in their lives. Among the possessions she brought with her from Kentucky was something that must have lit up the eyes of young Abraham: a small stack of books. Abraham Lincoln's new stepmother encouraged his powerful desire to learn. She also gave him something else.
What she gave him that he needed was affection, understanding. He and his father were, from an early time, at odds. Plenty of evidence of that. His father thought he was lazy.
From early on, he had this obsession with wanting to read, desire to learn. And in that frontier environment, sometimes that was seen as laziness, when there was so much physical need for felling the trees or planting the crops or simply surviving. So he had to fight against the mores of the area, which saw him as if he weren't doing what he should be doing, when his desire was so strong to be able to read and learn.
The testimony is that he would steal time from his father, that he would read at the end of the row when he had to plow or work the horse. And his father, according to his testimony of his cousins and so forth, was that his father would, hit him. His father is quoted as saying, "I had to drag the old sow up to the water tank to get her to drink, and now she won't stop drinking." And that was the analogy of Lincoln. I think he's saying he encouraged him to learn how to read, but now he can't get him to stop reading.
His father certainly was a self-made man. I think he was a man of industry, of integrity, an honest man. In fact, I think Abraham gets from his father these traits of maybe courage, honesty, and generosity. But he was a man of the soil. He was a man who used his hands. He was a man who did not use his mind, so to speak. In other words, he didn't, quote, waste his time in book learnings and education.
What we do know is that there was a division between them, and that division never healed. Lincoln's father was not at the wedding. Lincoln's father never saw the grandchildren, but they were born before he died. Lincoln himself did not go to his father's funeral, did not erect a stone over his father's grave. Some people theorize that it happened because Lincoln's father, after his second marriage, favored a stepson more than he favored his natural son of Lincoln, and that Lincoln saw this, and that in effect, that's why Lincoln used the imagery of a house divided speech so many times in his own career, that his own house was divided as he grew up.
Abe began taking on jobs away from the farm. That, in turn, led him to do something he probably never imagined, pleading his first law case with himself as the defendant. The trouble started when 18-year-old Abe Lincoln agreed to take 2 men from the Indiana shore out to the middle of the Ohio River to catch a steamboat. Lincoln later said that after the men boarded the steamer, they each gave him $1, which was more money than he had ever before earned for a whole day of work. But the Dill brothers, who ran the Ohio River Ferry in this area, weren't so happy with his good fortune, and Abe was charged with operating a ferry without a license. The trial of the Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Abraham Lincoln was held at a house that still stands along the Ohio River in Hancock County. The judge was Justice of the Peace Samuel Pate. At his trial, Abe argued that he was innocent because a ferry would have taken the men across the river. He had only taken them out to the middle. After checking the language of the law, Squire Pate agreed, and Abraham Lincoln was acquitted. It was a brief taste of success for Abe Lincoln in Kentucky, but back in Indiana, the struggles continued for the Lincolns. On January 20th, 1828, the family was dealt another terrible loss when Abraham's beloved sister Sarah, just 20 years old, died in childbirth.
Kentucky was the first West, but as it started to fill up with people, the West moved. And in fact, southern Indiana and southern Illinois were totally peopled by citizens that had been from Kentucky at one time.
My impression, however, is that they always looked back toward Kentucky as they would, if they had their druthers, they'd druther be in Kentucky.
The Lincolns went west, settling in Coles County, Illinois. After seeing his family established in their new home, Abe went out on his own. In July of 1831, 22-year-old Abraham Lincoln arrived in the village of New Salem, Illinois. For the first time in his life, Abe was on his own. And just as it was in Indiana, he found himself surrounded by folks who'd moved west from Kentucky. One of those transplanted Kentuckians was a fellow named Denton Offutt, who offered Abe a job as a clerk in his store. The Offutt General Store failed, and Lincoln found himself out of a job. So he decided to try his own hand at business. With his friend William Berry, another native Kentuckian, Lincoln bought one of New Salem's 3 general stores. Unfortunately, New Salem wasn't large enough to keep the 3 stores in business, and the Lincoln Berry store soon closed its doors. But there was one thing the lack of customers did give Abraham Lincoln: time to read and study and continue working to improve himself. New Salem, like much of Illinois, was filled with folks from Kentucky. Many of them were from my hometown right here in Greensburg and surrounding Greene County. They'd headed west for new land. One person told another, and so on, and that's how it all got started. One of the folks who headed out west was a teacher named Mentor Graham. He first taught here at the Greensburg Academy, built in 1815.
Mentor Graham has been somewhat legendized, just as Lincoln has, the school teacher with this wonderfully appropriate name. There's just no doubt that he, although Lincoln didn't sit in his classes, he did help Lincoln with mathematics. He befriended him in many ways. But I think it's significant, it's certainly significant for me, that when Lincoln said he wanted to study grammar, Mentor Graham says, I told him I thought that would be a good thing to do, and I encouraged him. And I told him where I knew there was a grammar that he could borrow. He didn't have any of his own. He sent Lincoln on this trip 8 miles north to borrow a grammar.
It's possible Abe Lincoln spent at least some of his time studying with yet another Kentuckian he met in New Salem, a young woman named Anne Rutledge. Anne was born when the Rutledge family lived in Henderson County, Kentucky. She was 16 when they moved to Illinois. No one knows exactly what the relationship was between Abraham Lincoln and Anne Rutledge, but several people who knew them at the time said they had plans to marry, but it was not to be. In the summer of 1835, Anne fell ill with brain fever, known today as typhoid fever. On August 25th of that same year, she passed away. She was only 22 years old.
People loved that story. And I think it was because people loved the story too much and made so much out of it and romanticized it and polished it so much that the Lincoln scholars got disgusted. And they said, well, you know, we don't know very much about Lincoln and Anne Rutledge, and we certainly don't know for sure what the status of their relationship was. It all depends on the memories of these people who testified when they were, much older, 30 years later. And granted that it's anything based on memory is you have to be careful about. I have to be careful about my own memory because I misremember things. And so we're well advised to do that. But I argued that the evidence for the Anne Rutledge story, that at least that they were in love, at least that they were engaged, and at least that he grieved excessively at her death. On those 3 points, the people are agreed. We don't have any disagreement about that.
Well, when you think of his childhood, when he had to suffer death again and again, first his mother dying when he was 9, and then his beloved sister Sarah in childbirth a few years later, and then his first love, Anne Rutledge, at the age of 22. And I think what happened is, over time, he began to get a certain comfort and solace from the notion that if you could accomplish something worthy in life, then your story could be told after you die. Your memory would live on in the memory of others. And that meant that the ambition that powered him was so much deeper than simply for office or power or celebrity. It was, as he put it, the desire to leave the world a better place for his having lived in it, so that his story could be told and he could live on after his life came to an end.
There was another young Kentuckian Abraham Lincoln courted during his time in Illinois. Her name was Mary. No, not Mary Todd. Mary Owens. And if Lincoln's relationship with Anne Rutledge was a tragedy, his courtship of Mary Owens had more of the makings of a comedy. Mary was born into a well-to-do family on this farm in Greene County. Her father owned 7,500 acres. The 4-story plantation home is no longer here. Just faded photographs are all that remain. Mary Owens was a well-educated woman. Before leaving Kentucky, she attended the Greensburg Academy. and those who knew her described her as an intellectual.
There's no doubt about this relationship because we have letters that he wrote to her. And we also have a letter that he wrote about this relationship to another woman.
There is a extraordinary letter that Lincoln writes to Mrs. Browning, the wife of Orville Browning, one of his friends, in which he flagellates, vilifies Mary Owens. It's not like Lincoln at all. He's very discreet and non-judgmental about other people's failings. But in this letter, he talks about Mary Owens, as fat as Falstaff, and having no front teeth.
He clearly got cold feet. But it's very Lincoln-esque kind of cold feet. It's clear from the letters that he had great doubts about whether he wanted to marry her. But if he had done or said anything that implied to her that he was interested in her, then he was. And if she didn't want to have a relationship with him, he says in these letters, she could just drop him and I'd be fine with him. They weren't much of a match.
Some of the finer points of social interaction, especially between men and women, clearly escaped Abraham Lincoln. And so, before the age of 30, he had failed at love and failed at business. But in another arena, he would prove himself much more capable. In 1834, at the age of 25, Abraham Lincoln began a long and eventful political career when he was elected to the Illinois State Legislature as a member of the Whig Party. Abraham Lincoln served 4 terms in the Illinois legislature. At the same time, he was using his uncommon intellect to teach himself the law, passing the state bar exam in 1836. The next year, he was offered a partnership with a Springfield attorney and native Kentuckian John Todd Stewart. The Illinois capital had recently moved from Vandalia to Springfield, so it's not surprising that an ambitious young attorney with political aspirations would settle here. Abraham Lincoln arrived in Springfield on April 15, 1837. On his first day in town, he met a young man named Joshua Speed, another Kentuckian who had come west some 3 years before.
It just was happenstance, a matter of luck, that when Abraham Lincoln arrived in Springfield, he was looking to borrow some money to set up housekeeping, and he happened to walk in to Joshua Speed's general store.
When Speed sees him in Springfield and Lincoln has just come into town, has no place to stay, and looks, as Speed said, like the saddest person he'd ever seen, and Speed just suddenly, spontaneously offers to let him stay in the same room where he was staying. And immediately Lincoln smiled and said, "Okay, I'm moved in," and goes running right upstairs. And the two of them really became great, great friends.
More than anybody else in his whole life, Lincoln seems to have identified with Speed as a person who understood him. And mainly it would seem from what they say in their letters, because they thought they had the same beliefs, the same fears, the same anxieties, the same doubts.
He and Lincoln both shared a love of poetry, a love of politics, and I think with Speed he could communicate this deep desire he had to really be something and know that Speed would understand that. They shared their anxieties about women, and Lincoln said to him, "This is a friendship that will never end."
A successful attorney and local politician, Abraham Lincoln also began to mingle among Springfield's upper-class social set. He had come a long way from the log cabin of his birth into a world that a young Kentucky boy could have barely imagined. The Kentucky of Lincoln's birth was an isolated, rural place, but there was another Kentucky too, a place of wealth and political influence. That Kentucky centered around the city of Lexington. Much of its political influence centered around the owner of this estate. The estate is called Ashland, and the owner was Henry Clay.
Henry Clay came as a young lawyer from Virginia, settled in Lexington, married into the aristocracy, but he was an ambitious man, and he very soon turned from law to politics. He becomes probably the most significant Whig politician of the mid-19th century.
The Whig Party supported a strong national government that provided funds for projects like roads, canals, and railroads. As the party's leader, Henry Clay had many admirers. Among them was Abraham Lincoln, who, living in the West, saw those improvements as indispensable to economic development on the frontier. While Lincoln admired Henry Clay for his political stand, it was another Lexingtonian who would capture Lincoln's heart. Like Clay, she was a member of the city's aristocracy. Her name was Mary Ann Todd.
She was born in 1818 into this large Todd family who were really founders of the community. She really entered Lexington society with a full dance card. Mary's life as a Kentuckian, the 20 years that she spent in Kentucky, really never leave her.
Mary Ann Todd had all the advantages wealth and social standing could give. Growing up in this beautiful home in Lexington, Kentucky, she never lifted a hand to work. It wasn't considered proper. In fact, slaves did all the work in the household. She wore the finest custom-made clothes and traveled in affluent social circles. Also, she had at least 10 years of formal schooling, making her one of the best educated young women in America.
At a time when only about 1,000 women of her generation finished 12 years of schooling, Mary Todd was different. In fact, what she was doing was going to school because she liked learning. She went to a famous boarding school in Lexington called Mentel's, and it's here where she learned her fluent French, and it's here as well where she learned a certain kind of sophistication and some social graces.
Like Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd lost her mother at a young age. But though both fathers remarried, the stepmothers could hardly have been more different.
His stepmother moved into the Lincoln home and became a very important and loved figure. Not in the Todd household. All the Todd sisters fled Lexington as soon as they could because of their stepmother.
The first to leave home was Mary's oldest sister, Elizabeth, who married Ninian Edwards, a student at Lexington's Transylvania College of Law. After Ninian's graduation, the couple moved to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. It wasn't long before Mary Todd followed.
And when she received an invitation from her sister, she jumped on a train and a boat and got there as soon as she could. So she takes up residence in Springfield with her sister and brother-in-law, and it is to that house that Mary's cousin, John Todd Stewart, the law partner of Abraham Lincoln, brings his partner to meet his cousin, Mary Todd.
I love the story of their first meeting when she's surrounded by beaux in her sister's mansion on the hill, and he watches her in deep conversation, very flirtatious, and goes up to her and says, "Mary, I want to dance with you in the very worst way." And then after they danced, she teasingly remarked, "He certainly did." I think when they first met, they were well suited for one another, Mary and Abe. She loved politics. She loved Henry Clay. She loved poetry. She could recite Shakespeare, as could Lincoln.
He was always, as we would say now, challenged by the demands of society, which I guess makes it all the more surprising that he was such a hit with the prize belle of the town, Mary Todd. And she really does seem to have picked Lincoln out.
The question, though, is why would Mary Todd have picked out Abraham Lincoln?
Why in the world would she ever fall in love with this goofus, this guy whose blue jeans didn't come down far enough, whose hair was sticking up all the time? I think that the answer to that is that she, to her credit, saw in him a man who would give her the freedom from the conventions that shackled women.
At any rate, she took to him and he took to her. The problem was it didn't stick.
And who ended that engagement? I'm not sure. Most people say Abraham Lincoln ended the engagement. By January 1st, 1841, it was over. And Lincoln is said to have gone into one of his periods of depression.
And his friends were worried that he was suicidal. They took all knives and razors and scissors from his room. And Speed went to his side and said, "Lincoln, you must rally or you will die." And he told Speed then, "I would just as soon die now, but I've not yet done anything to make any human being remember that I have lived."
Lincoln was at one of the lowest points in his life. He'd broken off his engagement to Mary Todd, and he'd decided not to run for re-election to the Illinois legislature. To make matters worse, his best friend Joshua Speed had left Springfield to return to his family home here in Louisville. In hopes of cheering up his friend, Speed invited Lincoln to visit him in Kentucky, an invitation that was quickly accepted. Lincoln spent several weeks at Farmington, where, for almost certainly the first time in his life, he had the luxury of doing nothing. Today, Farmington is a beautifully preserved old home on a few acres of land, but in 1841, it was a prosperous 500-acre hemp plantation. In many ways, Farmington was unlike anything 32-year-old Abe Lincoln had ever known. A world of wealth and privilege made possible by the labor of more than 50 slaves. He'd made 2 trips to New Orleans, so we know he had observed slavery before. But the few weeks he spent here may have been the first time Abraham Lincoln had ever looked closely into the human face of slavery. We don't know how Lincoln felt about the slaves he saw at Farmington in 1841, but we do know that on his journey home, he saw a dozen slaves shackled together on a steamboat being taken downriver to be sold. It was his first written observation of slavery, and a scene that he would recall even years later as a continued torment. We also know that after his visit to Kentucky, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd resumed their romance. And on November 4th, 1842, 33-year-old Abraham Lincoln and Mary Ann Todd, aged 23, were married at the home of Ninian and Elizabeth Todd Edwards.
As far as the Lincoln marriage is concerned, it too, like everything in Mary's life, is controversial. I happen to think that it was a successful marriage, and I think that there's evidence for that. These two were brought together by their intellectual interests, by their interest in books. They were certainly brought together by their 4 children, their agreement over how to raise their children, and they adored them, and they showed them off. The couple was also bonded by expectations for their future. If you're in politics, there's always something beyond and beyond and beyond.
And I think she continued to push him and say, yes, you can do more, you can do more. In fact, she said, I married him not because he's handsome, but because I thought he would be president of the United States.
And she wasn't always an ideal politician's wife in a lot of ways. But at the same time, she opened doors to Lincoln that he never would have been able to get through politically. She walked in the upper classes and allowed him access to those leaders, to those upper class people, and that helped his political career.
She knew politics and she had good ideas, and I think Lincoln listened to her. And whether she propelled him toward the presidency is hard to back up, but I think Lincoln didn't need much help in igniting his ambition.
He was ambitious from the beginning, and we know he wasn't avaricious. It wasn't to make money. It wasn't to acquire land or wealth.
I think he knew from a relatively early age that he was not like other guys, not like other kids, not like other young men. And I think he had a very strong sense of his own abilities. And he's a person who early on, because he was able to read and loved to read, identified with the great accomplishments of the founding fathers. And there were moments when he regretted that they had accomplished as much as they did. In fact, he says he's sorry that so many rivers and mountains were named for them, because there was not a field left for a new generation to equal their accomplishments.
Lincoln was a very shrewd politician. We sometimes think of this man who just kind of is brought to the forefront all of a sudden, but he knew politics and how they operated. I mean, this was a man who sat in the country stores and talked politics with people all the time. This was a man who made the political circuits as a lawyer and talked to people all across states and knew people that way. He knew the pulse of the people.
Lincoln maintained his interest in politics, but it was in the legal profession that he was making a name for himself. Dissolving his partnership with John Todd Stewart, he joined the law firm of a prominent Springfield attorney, Stephen T. Logan, where he remained for 3 years. After Lincoln ended his partnership with Logan, he took on a new partner, a young fellow born in my hometown of Greensburg, Kentucky. His name was William Herndon, and the two men would work together the rest of Lincoln's life.
Now, it would have been probably proper to have found an older man to be a senior partner, but there was something in Herndon that Lincoln liked. He was from Kentucky, after all, but he was young, he was ambitious, he was intelligent. He had a great library that he put together, and he brought that library to the law office. And Lincoln took advantage of that library, oftentimes pulling down books and reading, particularly books on political economy. But more than that, Herndon was a devout Whig, and he was very anti-slavery. And so I'm sure they must have talked not only about politics, but talked about slavery. And I think that Herndon reinforces Lincoln's attitude against slavery. It was a good partnership. Now, the problem is, of course, Mary Todd.
Almost from the beginning, William Herndon and Mary Todd Lincoln disliked one another. Among other things, he disapproved of the way the Lincolns allowed their children to behave, and she disapproved of anyone who disapproved of her. With encouragement from Mary, Abraham Lincoln sought higher political office and succeeded, winning a seat in the U.S. Congress as a representative from Illinois. In those days, typically politicians' wives and children stayed home. But Mary Todd Lincoln was far from typical. And so, in the fall of 1847, the Lincolns, with their 2 young sons in tow, took the train to Washington. On the way, they made a stop in Lexington, Kentucky to visit the Todd family. The Lincolns didn't know it, but a cousin of Mary's was traveling on the train to Lexington. Upon arriving at the Todd house, this cousin complained at great length about a pair of annoying young boys on the train whose father did nothing to discipline them.
He said, "Aunt Becky, I was never so glad in my life to get off of any train. You would not believe what I encountered. These young hellions were running loose, and all their father did was to sit there and smile and encourage them." Well, you can imagine his consternation when he then met Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln and found that these hellions were part of his family.
Despite the unpromising arrival, the Lincolns were welcomed by the Todds and enjoyed their time in Lexington, treating it as something of a vacation.
And Mary took the opportunity to introduce him to her family and to her friends, but she also introduced him to Henry Clay. And of course, this must have been a great thrill for Abraham Lincoln to meet this great man. But one of the things he also witnessed, and you couldn't avoid it in Lexington, particularly if you're in downtown Lexington, was slavery.
The home of Mary's grandmother on Short Street overlooked a slave pen, a sort of jail where slaves were kept before being sold at the auctions, held regularly on Cheapside next to the county courthouse. After 3 weeks in Lexington, the Lincolns continued their journey to Washington, D.C. This was the first time Abraham Lincoln had seen the nation's capital. Of course, as we know, it wouldn't be the last. In 1849, after serving a single term in Congress, Abraham Lincoln returned to the Springfield, Illinois home he shared with Mary and the children. His political career seemed to be at an end. The Whig Party was disintegrating. Party leader Henry Clay died in 1852. That same year, though the Whigs controlled the White House, they failed to nominate their own sitting president, Millard Fillmore, for re-election. The issue destroying the Whig Party was slavery. Now, some Whigs, like Abraham Lincoln, decided to leave politics altogether. Others, like the owner of this estate, Cassius Marcellus Clay, decided to shift their allegiance to other parties. Cassius Clay, a cousin of Henry Clay, joined the Liberty Party and became an outspoken opponent of slavery. A hero of the Mexican War and a fiery orator, Cassius Clay was one of the most colorful characters in American history. He was also very ambitious, with high hopes of becoming the President of the United States. Such ambitions were helped by living in a politically powerful state like Kentucky.
The state of Kentucky was very important as a power player in the nation. It had a very crucial location bordering the Ohio River, so that it was extremely important in terms of commerce. It also was very important in the sense that it had fertile fields, and it was producing great quantities of livestock and mules and horses, so that it was serving a great market, particularly in the South. Of course, it's also producing great quantities of good whiskey. And so Kentucky was a wealthy place with a much larger population proportionally than it has in our present day, and it was a force to be reckoned with.
In addition to its livestock and whiskey, Kentucky was also known for another highly prized commodity: slaves.
And in fact, Kentucky was sort of a hub of one of the very worst aspects of slavery, which was the slave trade.
Lexington and Louisville were known as two of the biggest slave markets in the South. It was also known as a market for fancy girls, young slave girls that would be sold to the brothels of New Orleans and places like that.
When we think about Southern slavery, we think about these big plantations with hundreds of slaves working in cotton. Kentucky was a state of small slaveholders. The average slaveholder in Kentucky owned about 5 slaves.
Kentucky was different in the sense that we didn't have the large plantations, but you still weren't your own person, and you could still be sold at a moment's notice or not, and you could still be separated from your family or used in any way.
There's been this sort of myth that Kentucky had this more sort of benign version of slavery because the working conditions here weren't so bad, so the myth goes. In truth, the conditions, while the sort of work patterns may have been different, slavery in essence is slavery. It's a lack of freedom. Slave owners in Kentucky were just as likely to be harsh on their slaves as were owners further south.
Slavery was rapidly becoming the dominant issue in American politics. There were many views on how America should deal with it. Abraham Lincoln opposed the spread of slavery. Cassius Clay began to advocate another point of view, emancipation. In the 1840s, Clay began publishing his views in a newspaper called The True American from offices in Lexington, Kentucky. Before long, though, his printing press was confiscated by a pro-slavery group, led ironically by one of the sons of Cousin Henry Clay. It just goes to show the bitter animosity, even within families, over the issue of slavery. And it was a conflict as old as the nation itself.
After the American Revolution, there was a belief that eventually gradual emancipation would work in freeing slaves. After they were taught and learned a trade, they would gain their freedom. This idea caught on in North and New England, but not through the South. The South began with ideas of gradual emancipation, but by 1820, gradual emancipation in the South was pretty much a done deal, an idea that people knew wouldn't happen.
Still, the call for freedom, even in a slave-holding state like Kentucky, could not be completely silenced.
The idea of abolitionism was just far too radical for Kentucky. Abolitionist slaves were beaten, returned to prison, lost their freedom just by advocating. But even then, you had people here in Kentucky who supported it. John Gregg Fee, Cassius Marcellus Clay, David Rice. You had all these people who were actively advocating in Kentucky to end slavery.
But their voices were seldom heard. As late as 1850, there had been an election where anti-slavery men were running for office to try to get elected, basically, to the Constitutional Convention and maybe do away with slavery. Not a single person who ran the anti-slavery ticket was elected.
Abraham Lincoln, who was in Kentucky during this period, settling the estate of his father-in-law, Robert Todd, had a chance to observe the debate over slavery.
What Lincoln observed was this, that even young men, even those who had no slaves, were fighting to keep slavery in the Constitution. And so Lincoln felt that if these people who had little stake in slavery could so tenaciously defend it, then if it ever got a foothold anywhere, it would hold on for dear life. So I think that Lincoln saw in Kentucky the need not to let slavery spread into 1 inch of additional territory.
For years, a series of congressional compromises had limited the spread of slavery. But in 1854, a U.S. senator from Illinois proposed changing the laws and opening the way for slavery in America's northern and western territories.
Stephen Douglas came forward to propose a Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would have had the effect of opening Kansas and Nebraska territories to slavery. This created a furor in the North. And what it does is lead to the formation of a new political party. And that political party is the Republican Party. And that's what Lincoln picks up on.
Many were attracted to the Republican Party's anti-slavery position. a coalition formed that included Northern Democrats, as well as former Whigs like Cassius Clay and Abraham Lincoln. But though Lincoln vehemently opposed the spread of slavery, he also held the view that the Constitution protected slavery in those states where it already existed.
He took seriously the promise of America, including being founded on the notion that all men were created equal. As he put it, by no means excluding black people. And as he went through the years and became a politician and realized that there were, I guess, pragmatic limits to how expressive you could be in defending people of color who A, didn't vote, and B, were generally not liked in white America, to be frank about it. It was not wise for Lincoln politically to become an outright abolitionist.
Lincoln's idea is that we've got to work towards getting rid of slavery. It's going to take a long time. It's a gradual process, but we can't expect it to happen today or tomorrow, and so forth. And we have to honor the constitutional commitments that the Southern states have to protect their slaves. This certainly sets him apart from abolitionists.
He has friends who are slaveholders. He understands the institution, and I think he's very much a man of the time. I think he has his own opinion about the inferiority of African Americans. So in his younger years, I think you could typify him as a typical Southerner who has a very biased opinion about African Americans.
Today, it's hard to imagine just how many Americans once accepted slavery. It seems strange to us that for many, it wasn't seen as a moral issue, but as an economic one. This was certainly true of Abraham Lincoln's old friend from Kentucky, Joshua Speed.
The Speed family, even though they were slave owners, were like many slave owners, like of the Henry Clay stripe, they were anti-slavery. They did not believe slavery was a just system or a good system. They just didn't know how to get rid of it.
I think that their conscience bothered them, but their pocketbook tied them down.
Those who benefited from 200 years of free labor felt that it was just absolutely essential to the economy, particularly in the early development of the state. They had free labor to clear the land, to blaze the trail, to raise the crops, to dig up the clay and fire the bricks and build the houses. Doubtlessly, Kentucky would not have developed as quickly as it did without benefit of that labor. And so whether we're talking in terms of dollars or whether we're talking in terms of just pure labor, whether it was domestic or field labor, the slave owners felt that it was vital. The bigger question is, less than 10%, say, of Americans owned slaves. How it is they were able to convince the other 90% that slavery is our way of life is an interesting phenomenon.
In Lincoln's case, he finally came to the realization that there's some causes that you cannot compromise on. And to him, slavery was one of those causes, and the Union was another one. Sometimes you just have to take a stand.
Now, he decides that he's going to be the leader of the Republican Party in Illinois, and he sets about, very quickly, achieving that fame. In 2 years, he is so important in Illinois politics that he's selected to run for the United States Senate against the incumbent Stephen Douglas.
During the Senate campaign of 1858, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas held a series of 7 public debates. Slavery, especially the extension of slavery, was the primary issue.
And even though he loses that election to Stephen Douglas, he nevertheless gains a national reputation. By the end of 1858, Lincoln's name is known across the country, and he is beautifully positioned to be a candidate for President of the United States.
Having just seen major Republican election victories in Ohio and Indiana, he realized that the Republican Party could well win the presidential election in 1860, and he wanted to be a player. And to be a player, he had to identify himself as a viable candidate. And to do that, you have to be in New York. You have to make an appearance in New York.
Lincoln was invited to speak at Cooper Union, a new college that had just opened. He was the last of a series of anti-slavery men from the West, invited to New York by a group of Republicans searching for a presidential candidate.
In contrast to the other anti-slavery orators who would argue that the Southerners were evil, unchristian men, the cause of all misery in the world, he would say they are what we would be in their situation, that if the South no longer had slavery, they would not introduce it. If we in the North still had slavery, we would not know how to get rid of it instantly. I don't feel right judging them for not doing what I myself would not know what to do.
All of these speakers were popular with New Yorkers because they were Western speakers liked to take their ties off and then their vests and then loosen their shirts and throw their jackets on the ground. Lincoln wasn't like those speakers. He didn't, as William Herndon said, he didn't saw the air for effect or fling his hand to catch bees. That was an expression. He very carefully laid out his research with a little humor thrown in. And then he would shift gears in the middle of the speech and appeal to the heart as well as the mind. So it was a different kind of a speech. He was a different kind of a public speaker.
Lincoln also stood out because of the way he looked and sounded.
Lincoln never lost his Kentucky accent. It's one of the things he carries through his life, in addition to all of these other influences. He kind of had apparently a rather high-pitched voice and something of a nasal twang, and I think that his speech must have been truly Western.
And I don't know if anybody reported an audible gasp when he stood up, but his feet were so big, his sleeves were so short, his hair was so unkempt. He was so proud of the fact that he bought a new $100 suit before he left Springfield, but he made the fatal mistake of either packing it badly or sleeping in it, because it was badly wrinkled. And when he rose to speak, a journalist in the audience scribbled down, "Old fellow, this won't do, this is New York." But eventually they were captivated by him. There was something about what he said. There was a fire in his eyes. We were transfixed after 10 minutes. We no longer saw his clothes. We no longer thought he spoke in a funny manner. We only heard the ideas.
The Cooper Union Address and his debates against Stephen Douglas made Lincoln a household name, and in the summer of 1860, he won the Republican nomination for president. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party split, with the Northern wing nominating Stephen Douglas of Illinois and the Southern Democrats choosing Kentuckian John C. Breckinridge.
Two people born in Kentucky, Breckinridge and Lincoln. And to most Kentuckians, though, voting in 1860 for Abraham Lincoln would have been voting for a communist in the 1950s, or even voting for a terrorist now.
Lincoln got almost no votes in Kentucky. I think he got 5 votes out of Fayette County. His family didn't even vote for him. John Breckinridge does not carry Kentucky, even though he's a native son and a Southern Democrat. It is John Bell, the Constitutional Union, who wins Kentucky in 1860, because Kentucky was fearful that if the war came and the Union divided, it would be the battleground between North and South, given its strategic and vulnerable location.
Lincoln did not win Kentucky, but of course we know he did win the presidency. Soon after the election, Abraham and Mary Lincoln went to Chicago, where they met with Joshua Speed and his wife Fanny. Lincoln wanted a Kentuckian to serve in his cabinet, and he wanted that Kentuckian to be Joshua Speed. But Speed declined, telling Lincoln that he was a wealthy man and couldn't afford to take a government job. Lincoln was disappointed that his oldest and dearest friend wouldn't be accompanying him to Washington. Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was a man who desperately needed friends. In the 4 months between his election and inauguration, 7 southern slave states seceded from the Union, and several others, including Kentucky, were in serious doubt. We know Kentucky was on his mind because of a draft of a speech he wrote, speaking directly to Kentucky and through it to all of the South. He was being pressured by people on all sides to make a deal that would appease the secessionists.
What he wants to say, and he's trying to wait until the inauguration speech to say, is it isn't right for a president to be elected on a platform and then, as soon as he's elected, yield to the people who couldn't beat him and give in to what they want, so that the people who elected him don't get what they voted for.
We have no record that Lincoln ever actually delivered the speech he wrote, but the tone of his writing was clear.
People say that with a word I could solve this situation. But what word? Who amongst you would not die by the proposition that your candidate being elected should be inaugurated solely on the conditions of the Constitution and laws, or not at all? What Kentuckian worthy of this birthplace would do this? Gentlemen, I too am a Kentuckian.
When Abraham Lincoln arrived in Washington in 1861, he was confronted with the most extraordinary circumstances any president had ever had to face. Most of the South, 7 states, had seceded from the Union, and more were prepared to follow. By the time the Lincolns took up residence on March 4th, 1861, 1/3 of the United States, whose Constitution the president had sworn to preserve, protect, and defend, was gone. The secessionists created a new government, the Confederate States of America. Ironically, they, just as the Union had, chose a native Kentuckian as president.
Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were born less than 8 months and 80 miles apart in Kentucky. And they both left the state when fairly young, one going north and one going south. And it's kind of interesting to think about what would the nation's history have been had the two reversed directions, Davis north and Lincoln south. But they didn't. They went those ways. They became leaders of the respected causes. And in a sense, that symbolized what it was for Kentucky. Kentucky was torn both ways.
6 weeks after Lincoln took office, the secession crisis escalated when Confederates attacked a federal fort off the coast of South Carolina. Fort Sumter, under the command of a Louisvillian, Major Robert Anderson, surrendered to Confederate forces on April 14, 1861. Suddenly, the newly elected president was confronting decisions that would determine the destiny of the nation.
See, there were lots of people, even in his party, who didn't want to fight the war, who said, let them go. They want to secede? Let them go. And he said, no, won't do that, because that destroys the government. And that is letting the minority dictate to the majority.
Abraham Lincoln was widely viewed in the South as a radical abolitionist, what they disdainfully called a black Republican. But though Lincoln had often stated his belief that slavery was wrong, he also held that, as president, he had no constitutional basis to act on that belief.
He was willing to do whatever he had to do to save the Union. And he even said, if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would. If I could do it by freeing none of them, I would. If I could do it by freeing some of them, I would. In general, we forget that the Civil War starts out as a war to preserve Union rather than a war to end slavery.
Kentucky was very much a Union state, even though now we say it was evenly divided, but the majority of the people were Unionists. They did not want to see the Union break. They did, however, want to keep slaves.
They are actually convinced that staying in the Union is the best way to preserve the institution of slavery.
America was at war with itself. And in the border state of Kentucky, representatives speaking for both sides in the conflict gathered to decide if the state would join the Confederacy or stay with the Union. In May 1861, the legislature met in Frankfort, debating in this very room in what is now known as the old state capitol. I can just see them in these chairs debating back and forth, finally issuing that resolution that said Kentucky would not take sides in the conflict. And while for a nation at war, neutrality was no more constitutional than secession, the politically astute president was willing to accept that neutrality, at least for a while.
Well, Lincoln understood that Kentucky, part of her soul in a certain sense, was with the South, but if he could keep her in the Union, he thought it would affect all the other border states and would affect the war.
Lincoln felt that to lose Kentucky would be to lose the strategic defense position, to lose the use of the Ohio River, and may very well have led to the loss of other border states such as Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware.
The notion that Kentucky would remain neutral while a civil war raged all around was a long shot indeed. And on September 3rd, 1861, Confederate General Leonidas Polk made a decision and set into motion a series of events that ended any thought that Kentucky would not be drawn into the war. General Polk, believing Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant were preparing to attack, reacted by seizing Columbus, Kentucky, a tiny town with an impressive location overlooking the Mississippi River. After he took the town, he had his men stretch this ship's anchor chain from here on the Kentucky side all the way across the Mississippi to Belmont, Missouri. That way he could stop any river traffic. Grant responded by capturing the town of Paducah, Kentucky, just north of here. Then the Confederates took Bowling Green. Kentucky could no longer escape the war that was tearing the country apart. Through political maneuvering by Lincoln and his Kentucky allies, Unionists were finally able to gain control of the state's legislature. For now, at least, Kentucky was safely within the Union. The ongoing struggle to save the Union was utmost in Abraham Lincoln's mind. But for Mary Lincoln, the struggles were much more personal.
I think Mary Lincoln's life as First Lady tells us something about human existence. Here she is, this ambitious political woman, and she and her husband reach the pinnacle. He's the president, she's the First Lady. And what happens? Abraham Lincoln is only a war president. This is what marks his entire administration.
Mary Lincoln was also viewed with mistrust by many, both in Washington, D.C. and throughout the North, because of her family's Confederate connections. 3 of her half-brothers, sons of her father and stepmother, were serving in the Confederate Army.
So even though she didn't know these half-brothers very well, this was a real wrench for her. She's probably the strongest Unionist in the United States of America, but nonetheless, the fact that she has these half-brothers is sufficient, along with her viscous Kentucky accent to make her into a Confederate sympathizer.
The Lincolns' ambitions had helped make them the most powerful couple in America. But with that power came more sorrow than they could ever have imagined. Less than a year after arriving in Washington, Abraham and Mary Lincoln's two younger sons contracted typhoid fever. 8-year-old Tad recovered, but on February 20th, 1862, 11-year-old Willie Lincoln died in his White House bedroom. It was a loss from which the President and First Lady never fully recovered.
For Lincoln, the loss of Willie was a devastating loss. This was the child that was so much like Lincoln. Everybody said at 10 years old he could write poetry, he was sensitive and kind, although I suppose in some ways it gave him even a deeper empathy than he already possessed for what families all over the country were going through in the loss of loved ones during the war.
It's not surprising that the Lincolns sought out what little peace and quiet they could find in the nation's capital. President Lincoln and his family spent a great deal of time, especially in the summer, at the Soldiers' Home, a place of respite for aged and disabled veterans a few miles north of the White House. It was a place where the Lincolns could escape the oppressive summer heat of Washington and the city's constant political pressures. It must have been quite a relief to get away for a while. In fact, Mary Todd Lincoln later recalled just how much she loved it here. When the Lincolns came to the grounds of the Soldiers' Home, they stayed in this house, known today as Anderson Cottage. And it was here that President Lincoln finished the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was a brief document, just over 3 handwritten pages. But it turned the focus of the conflict from a war to preserve the nation to a war to end slavery. And it altered the ending of a long and often tortured chapter in American history.
Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863 in the afternoon, and that morning he had had a huge public reception, and he had shaken so many hands that morning that afternoon when he went to sign the proclamation, his own hand was numb and shaking. So he put the pen down and he said, "If ever my soul were in an act, it is in this act. But if I sign with a shaking hand, posterity will say he hesitated." So he put the pen down until he could finally pick it up and sign with a bold and clear hand.
With a few pen strokes, Abraham Lincoln had done what many had long believed was impossible. Still, it wasn't a perfect solution.
The Emancipation Proclamation only freed those slaves that were in states in rebellion against the Union. Since Kentucky was not one of those states, in Maryland and Missouri and Delaware, enslaved people in those 4 states were not emancipated by the proclamation.
By 1862, the war had spread well into the Western theater, including Kentucky. In January, the Battle of Mill Springs halted a Confederate campaign into the eastern part of the state. It's often been called the first significant Union victory of the war. Then, on July 4th, 2 regiments under Confederate General John Hunt Morgan left Knoxville, Tennessee, launching his first raid into Kentucky and causing widespread panic. Within a few weeks, Union loyalists had even more reason for concern when a 2-pronged Confederate invasion swept through the state, winning battles at Munfordville and Richmond, and taking both Lexington and Frankfort before turning back. But it was an October day in 1862, just outside the town of Perryville in Boyle County, that saw the single most deadly event in Kentucky history. By the end of the day, more than 1,400 men, both Union and Confederate, were dead. Another 6,000 were captured, wounded, or missing. The Battle of Perryville was not a decisive victory for either side, but it did mark the end of the Confederate campaign in Kentucky. Try as we might, for those who have never lived it, we cannot imagine the hell-on-earth chaos of the battlefield. Maybe nowhere is that more apparent than at the site of the most famous battle of the American Civil War. Today, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania is beautiful, park-like.
From up here on Little Round Top, looking down at the peaceful valley below, it's really hard to imagine what happened here. But for 3 days in July of 1863, a battle raged. Finally, Union forces under General Meade pushed back Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. By July 4th, every building in Gettysburg was being used as a hospital, and every pasture, every field, and every lawn was marked by the raw earth of hastily dug graves.
Nearly 8,000 men died on the battlefield at Gettysburg. Many thousands more would die from their wounds. Within a few weeks, local citizens made plans for a cemetery dedicated to the fallen Union soldiers of Gettysburg. President Lincoln was one of the invited guests.
This is the Gettysburg National Cemetery, dedicated just 4 months after the battle. In November of 1863, President Lincoln came to the cemetery dedication. Ironically, he was not the featured speaker of the day. He was asked to, quote, give a few appropriate remarks, unquote. He spoke for just 2 minutes, 269 words. But oh, what words they were.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
By 1863, President Lincoln knew Kentucky was securely in the Union. He then looked to the state to take on another role, preparing soldiers for battle at places like Camp Nelson in Jessamine County.
In 1863 and 64, Camp Nelson was a Union Army recruiting and training center, and it would have been teeming with activity. There were thousands of troops here, and 300 buildings, including barracks, a prison, and a hospital. By the beginning of 1864, 3 years into the war, the Union Army was in desperate need of more soldiers. That need led President Lincoln to authorize the recruitment of black Kentuckians into the United States colored troops. In all, about 24,000 black Kentuckians served in the Union Army, one of the largest totals of any state.
Left face! Fire!
Bowling Green, Paducah, Covington. They were recruiting stations all over the state. And African Americans were coming here from everywhere. They were coming from Tennessee and Georgia and Mississippi, Alabama to enlist. So this became a very important fighting force for Lincoln.
Camp Nelson trained more than 10,000 United States colored troops. For enslaved men in Kentucky, military service was a means to gain not only their own freedom, but freedom for their families.
The influence of Camp Nelson in Kentucky is the handiwork directly of Abraham Lincoln. He authorizes the Union Army to recruit in Kentucky actively, disregarding what he had promised Confederates about not losing their slaves. Lincoln actively brings in John Gregg Fee and others to implement housing for not only the soldiers but for the families. There's a school, there's a hospital that takes in these refugees. Lincoln is directly responsible for that. So these are all important things, I believe, to look at when you're talking about a military history and Lincoln's contributions.
The possibilities of a better future may have given hope to Black Kentuckians, but many white Kentuckians viewed Lincoln's actions as betrayal.
I think a lot of Kentuckians turn against the war, and they turn against Lincoln, who signifies, reflects that war.
When they saw African Americans, ex-slaves in Union uniforms with rifles in their hands, and in a sense, the view that they were being equal of the white man, that antagonized Kentuckians, even those who were fighting for the Union. And people were deserting the Union, they were leaving the Union, and it changed the whole outlook of the state.
The Union Army's occupation of the state, the loss of markets, the rejection of racial equality, a belief the federal government couldn't and shouldn't override state laws. For all of these reasons, many Kentuckians were angry, and much of that anger was directed at their native son, Abraham Lincoln. For some, but by no means all, that changed suddenly. By April of 1865, Abraham Lincoln had won re-election, and the long and bitter Civil War was at last coming to an end. Then across the telegraph wires came the news that an actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth had shot the president. Abraham Lincoln died the next morning, April 15, 1865, at the age of 56.
And I think there was a genuine outpouring of grief based upon true shock. The man who, for 4 years, had been the center of all attention is now gone.
As the nation mourned, Kentucky Governor Thomas Bramlett, who had long been a vocal critic of the president, stood before a huge crowd on the steps of the courthouse in Louisville.
Governor Bramlett said that in this great Civil War, we disagreed, but we disagreed upon a provincial basis, and he disagreed on a broader basis. And in that disagreement, we were wrong, and he was right.
Abraham Lincoln, born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, was laid to rest in this monumental granite and marble tomb in Springfield, Illinois. The man many underestimated in life became larger than life in death. The honoring of Abraham Lincoln took on mythic proportions in the years following his death. His wife, Mary, was not so lucky.
When we do polls of first ladies, we find that Mary Lincoln is at the bottom. I believe that Mary Lincoln plays a shrew in the popular imagination to Abraham Lincoln's deity.
Her image wasn't helped by a public estrangement from her eldest and only surviving son, Robert. Worse, though, was an 1889 biography of Abraham Lincoln written by his longtime law partner, William Herndon.
Much of our attitude against Mary Todd must come from Herndon's biography of Lincoln. He talked about his old friend and how he rose from obscurity to the highest pinnacle of power, but he said it was not due in any way to Mary Todd. In fact, she had been in every way a hindrance to him. Herndon called her a she-devil.
Unlike Mary, Abraham Lincoln was a beloved figure to many, but he was also widely condemned, especially in the South. And in the state where he was born, opinions about Lincoln were mixed.
It's a matter of states' rights in Kentucky, and we can never get away from that issue of states' rights. And the issue of states' rights centers upon slavery.
At the beginning of the Civil War, 1 in every 5 Kentuckians was a slave. 5 years later, those slaves were free.
One of the great changes in Kentucky life was the end of slavery, because now you have a 20% of the population that have changed status. They are free, and they have to now adjust to a new system of race relations.
President Lincoln had offered the border states a plan for compensated emancipation, with the federal government paying owners as much as $400 for every freed slave. Kentuckians rejected the plan.
Kentuckians just didn't think slavery would ever come to an end. I've run across numerous accounts where there were actual slave auctions taking place in December of 1865, same day the 13th Amendment was ratified at the federal level.
What the 13th Amendment did is simply to free all of the slaves. Kentucky loses its slaves without any penny of compensation. And that, I think, led to some bitterness, maybe a lot of bitterness after the Civil War, a bitterness against Lincoln.
They feel that the agreement they felt they had brokered with Lincoln really had been false. And then they're faced with an economy without slavery.
So what they do after the war is they mimic the behavior of Confederates further south. You know, they vote overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates. They start writing black codes that prohibit African Americans from acting on their new freedom. They do a lot of things that make them look like the Confederate South.
Confederate monuments began to appear in cemeteries and on courthouse lawns across the state. The most impressive was the 350-foot obelisk built at Fairview, site of the birthplace of Confederate President Jefferson Davis.
Kentucky developed historical amnesia after the war. They forgot that they had been a Union state. They stressed their Confederate heroes, the John Hunt Morgans, the Orphan Brigades. Those became the heroes after the war. Overall, maybe as many as 100,000 Kentuckians fought for the North, and maybe as many as 40,000 fought for the South, so a lot more fought for the North.
Many people in Kentucky like to say, well, my ancestor fought in the Confederate Army, when statistics show that many more soldiers went to the Union Army than ever went to the Confederate Army. And I believe there's only one courthouse in this state that has a monument to a Union soldier.
When the Lincolns left here in 1811, Abraham was 2½. No one had any concept that this land or that young boy would ever have any significance. No one paid any attention to what was going on here until about 1895, as the centennial of Lincoln's birth approaches.
A group called the Lincoln Farm Association was organized and began raising money to buy the sinking spring land for a memorial. Many famous and influential Americans of the time were involved, including Mark Twain and William Jennings Bryan. Only 2 Kentuckians took leadership roles in establishing a memorial: Henry Watterson, publisher of the Courier-Journal, and Governor Augustus Wilson. Ultimately, the effort was successful and the results impressive, though the memorial was not quite so grand as originally envisioned.
It was going to be quite the extravagance on this rural piece of farmland. They weren't able to raise all of the money. They had to scale back their project somewhat. They raised about $350,000, so John Russell Pope designed the building that we see today.
President Teddy Roosevelt came to Hodgenville in 1909 for the laying of the cornerstone, and President Taft was there for the dedication of the memorial building. Around that same time, a large bronze sculpture was placed in the Hodgenville Town Square. Another was unveiled in the state capitol rotunda in 1911, and one in Louisville in 1922. Through the years, there would occasionally be acknowledgments, especially in cemeteries, of the state's loyalty to the Union. But it would be nearly a century before Kentuckians would again erect a monumental statue of the Kentucky-born president who preserved that Union. In the first half of the 20th century, the primary honor afforded President Lincoln in Kentucky was in the naming of many of the state's racially segregated all-black schools.
I attended an elementary and high school in Stanford, Kentucky that was named after Abraham Lincoln. The school, of course, had been dedicated to him in memory of the great work that he had done regarding the elimination of slavery.
He was beloved. There would never be a house in an African-American community that did not have a portrait of Lincoln, along with Washington and Martin Luther King. Those were some people that you had to have in your home if you're African-American.
It took a long time, but attitudes slowly began to change. The turning point for many Kentuckians seemed to come with the outlawing of segregation and the growing civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. The state of his birth at last seemed ready to reconsider Lincoln.
And only over time did we start to reclaim the real history that was Kentucky in that time period. And we start to reclaim Abraham Lincoln in his rightful place in that history.
In 1975, Kentucky finally honored its most famous native son by erecting this monument at the site where Lincoln delivered his immortal Gettysburg Address. This is the only Kentucky monument among 1,300 others scattered throughout these hallowed fields.
(1975) was also the year Hodgenville, Kentucky celebrated its first Lincoln Days Festival, now an annual event drawing tens of thousands.
Lincoln Days in Hodgenville is a quite unique celebration. It helps us to travel back in time a bit and to see what the world was like during Lincoln's day, to get a flavor for Kentucky of the early 1800s. The rail splitting, the costume contest, the Lincoln look-alikes, and Pioneer Games, they all come together to present a unique experience for those that participate and are able to watch.
Hodgenville is also home to a Lincoln Museum. Opened in 1989 through the efforts of local volunteers, It's the only museum in Kentucky dedicated solely to the life of the 16th president. The museum's collection includes depictions of events from his life and a gallery of artwork devoted to images of Lincoln. Even Mary Todd Lincoln received a bit of redemption when, in 1977, her dilapidated family home in Lexington was restored as the first historic site to honor a First Lady. As the 2009 bicentennial of his birth approached, Kentucky actually seemed to fall into the grasp of a sort of Lincoln mania. There were concerts and dramatizations and other events across the state. The Kentucky Lincoln Heritage Trail was also unveiled, highlighting the people and places in Lincoln's life. In Louisville, renowned sculptor Ed Hamilton was asked to create a new monumental statue of Abraham Lincoln for the city's waterfront park. The sculpture and related pieces are scheduled to be installed in 2009 in honor of Lincoln's 200th birthday.
As a sculptor, you try to capture emotion, you try to capture their spirit, their character. And that's what I like to do, is kind of get into the persona of what I'm working on. It's what he had within him, that was so impressive to me. His face has such character to it, that's what I liked about it. All these wrinkles, all these hollow places, and that distinctive wart. You gotta put everything in there that's there.
And when it comes to Lincoln, putting everything in there that's there is a monumental challenge.
I think trying to judge Lincoln based upon our standards today of what we wished he had done or think he should have done, you can never judge a person that way. And to look at his views and how those changed, it says a lot about Kentucky. And now we want to examine his life and understand that his influence, his early influence, was a Kentucky influence.
We have to remember that history isn't just a set of discrete facts that just happens. That history is really the way that people have perceived facts, and the way that they choose to remember their history tells us as much about them as it does about history itself.
Well, we've come a long way. From the steps of the monument at Abraham Lincoln's birthplace in Hodgenville, Kentucky, to the Lincoln Memorial here in the nation's capital. From the outside, the two monuments look a lot alike, both designed to look like Greek temples. But from the inside, you can see the arc of Lincoln's life, from the frontier log cabin of his birth to the larger-than-life stature of the man in the chair. Quite a journey. And we've had quite a journey too, and we hope you've learned a few things about Kentucky's most honored native son, and all the Kentuckians that played such a vital role in his life. But in spite of all we know, there still remains a sense of mystery about Mr. Lincoln.
And just maybe, that is how it should be.
Lincoln, I Too Am a Kentuckian is made possible in part by a grant from the Kentucky Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, leading Kentucky's commemoration of the 200th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, celebrating his Kentucky story and his legacy of freedom, democracy, and equal opportunity for all. And by the Kentucky Historical Society, providing connections to the past, perspective on the present, and inspiration for the future. Administrator of the Kentucky Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission.